bring on our next guest, Fred. Thoughts about this? I told you about this amazing guest, and what I liked about her is she didn't have like just biographical about Trader Joe's. She understood the business, and I think that was the big part for me to understand. A lot of times people do biography, but they don't understand the business. She really understood the business, and I enjoyed it as much. Before we bring Patty on here, what were your thoughts about the book? And then I'll let you take over because
Well, why don't I save that until she comes on?
Okay, well, let's bring her on. And by the way, she is like the nicest person.
She is wonderful.
She is absolutely wonderful. And by the way, she knew who I was before the interview. She was like, "Oh my God, JT FOXX went on." I'm like, "Yeah." No, she goes, "No, I saw you here and here." I'm like, "Oh." But first of all, thank you, Patty. I remember as soon as I'd done the interview, we stopped the interview and I did a more in-depth interview. So you will have Fred's version and you'll have my version. It'll be interesting. And Fred and I have two different styles, two different sets of questions. But, as soon as I got off the phone, you and I chatted, we text, and I got off the phone with you and I called Fred. That was my first phone call, and Fred just took over. So I am going to cede this interview, just listen to the background. Also, if you are brand new here, there's about 43 people, you are not part of the scaling circle, Fred would like to meet you at the end. So this is your opportunity, one by one, tell people what you do and what's your biggest scaling challenge, and let the genius Fred go. And this interview is more about every week we have different things going on. A lot of times Fred will be teaching, but now we want to do once a month, maybe this idea of taking other businesses and learning from other businesses as well. So Fred, I cede to you.
All right. Well, Patty and I had a wonderful conversation. We had scheduled it for maybe a half an hour. I think we went for a couple hours because I was just so intrigued at listening to everything and the stories about it. But before I get into the interview, I just got to tell you what happened today. My kids got off from school, hurricane day, although it's not too bad where we are at all. So it was a hurricane. So I decided, all right, let's get up early and we'll go over to Starbucks. Well, Starbucks had already shut down. But right next to the Starbucks is, of course, Trader Joe's, where we are. So I ended up spending my morning at Trader Joe's with the kids. And you can't, the thing about Trader Joe's for me is you can't walk into Trader Joe's and buy something and walk out. You have to walk down every aisle, it seems like, at least I do, and look and discover something new. And I don't know if you've all been to Trader Joe's in the past couple of weeks, but it's like pumpkin heaven right now. And I mean, all the little stuff, if you like anything pumpkin spice or fall or apples, now's the time to go, because I was discovering all sorts of fun products there. And so I've already had my fix of Trader Joe's today, but this is the remarkable book, Becoming Trader Joe. It's about Joe Kalum. And Patty had just an extraordinary opportunity, really, in writing this book, in that Joe had kept a lot of journals, and they handed everything to you, Patty. You got it all. And he had written an awful lot. And what I think is so remarkable is that Joe passed before this book was actually published, unfortunately. But you were able to capture his voice so well. I mean, I really felt I was listening to Joe as I read this book, and it really is something. And when I JT mentioned I ordered it and did have it overnight delivered. I think it was on a Saturday. That you and I might have met on a Monday or something. And my son was so amazed. He said, "Dad, you read that whole book in one day. How did you do that?" I said, "It's a good book. I couldn't put it down. I just had to keep reading it." So it reads really, really well and just keeps you moving throughout the whole story of becoming Trader Joe from the early days and until he sold it and even beyond that. So congratulations on an extraordinary book, Patty.
Thank you so much.
Really, really a great book. And I'll talk a little bit about you at the end too, because you're quite an accomplished author as well. So let's talk a little bit about, I think what I found so interesting about Trader Joe's, about Joe, is that there were very distinct phases of his life. There was the early Joe, I'll call him the middle Joe, and then the later Joe. And I don't know if Trader Joe's reflected who he was as a person and how that transformed his stores. But I was utterly shocked to realize the earliest Trader Joe's, you could go in there and buy whiskey and ammo in the early days. So talk a little bit about maybe the earliest days, and then we'll just kind of work through these phases of his life, which were reflected in the retail outlets as well.
Well, okay, first of all, I just want to say hello, and thank you so much for having me here today. Yes, Joe was an amazing individual, which is obvious by his legacy. Can you hear me okay? Is audio coming through okay? Okay. Basically, yeah, what you said was really interesting. Joe had the way, first of all, you heard Joe's voice in the book because those were Joe's words. The book was primarily drawn from Joe's journals. So you really are reading Joe's words, his comments, his thoughts. So that was Joe you were hearing. So I'm glad you noticed that. But Joe had 3 basic phases of the company during his tenure in the store. And the first one was called Good Time Charlie. And the Good Time Charlie phase was sort of the real early phase where he was sort of testing things out. His early vision for the store was kind of a variety store for like guys. Now this was, think about the 60s where life was real different. And this was all in California. And he wanted a place where, like, guys can go and get stuff guys needed. They could get bullets for their guns, or they can get, nudie lady magazines, and they could get, campfire stove stuff, and they could get, chili and con carne in cans, and, just sort of, he called this phase his Good Time Charlie phase, and he kind of wanted to appeal to that good old boy sort of sensibility that he related to, because he was in his 20s, so he was sort of living that life, and that was the guy, it was his buddies that he was sort of wanting to appeal to at the time, and that was the nature of the early part of the store. Now, back then the store had a different name. It wasn't called Trader Joe back then, it was called Pronto Markets, and Joe, again, his vision for the store was sort of that Good Time Charlie, and that was the phase Joe was going through. And as we go through these 3 phases of the store, you're going to see that the store went through them because these were the phases that Joe went through. So that was kind of the 60s when Joe was in his 20s. Then a few years went by, and now we have Trader Joe's, and he's experimenting differently. He is seeing a whole different kind of an audience because it's post-World War II, post-Korea, post-Vietnam. He sees that the GI Bill has enabled so many people to get an education, that more people are getting an education in the United States than in the history of the country, by magnitudes. I mean, I think, and he mentions the exact numbers in the book, and I don't have them in my head right now, but he talks about how people with college educations were something like in the low 20%, right, in the 40s and 50s, but by the 60s and 70s, that number had moved into the 80 percentile and then into the 90 percentile as the years went on. So Joe saw a whole different kind of an audience, and he had kind of grown out of his college boy, Good Time Charlie phase. In the meantime, life in California was changing as well. People were kind of tired of the big grocery vendors at the time, and those guys were sort of the Swanson frozen food dinners and Del Monte canned beans and things like this that I don't know about you, but I grew up, my mom put these kind of things on our table, but America, and especially California, was getting kind of tired of products that had a lot of steroids and preservatives and frozen things, and they wanted to go back to growing their own food. Well, here comes Joe's next phase of life. Somebody gave him a squash plant that he planted at his house, and he got it sort of opened up a whole new world for him, where he grew squash and pumpkins in his yard here in Pasadena, California. And but this opened up a new phase for Joe, his phase that he calls his whole earth Harry phase. And this is where he starts pulling products. He gets more into food. He starts pulling away from the magazines and the ammo and the, you know, the good time boy stuff. And he starts getting more and more into food. He sees that his audience is getting, his customer base is more educated. They're asking him for food that they cannot find in the local grocery stores. He sees that this educated world is now flying around the world for the first time in history, because back in this time, Boeing came out with the 747, making global flight come down to a price level that reached Main Street, and now these educated people were traveling the world. Joe was watching all of this in his head like a movie. He saw this transition happening, and he was changing himself, and his store was sort of evolving to this. So he evolved out of his good time Charlie phase into his whole earth Harry phase, and he embraced the whole earth foods, you know, foods that were wholesome, more, you know, less sugar, less preservatives, no, you know, not frozen, and you know, all these kinds of things that you couldn't get in other supermarkets. And that was the second phase. The third phase was, now Joe is in his 40s, and now he's kind of, now, you know, now we're in our 70s, it's the 1970s, 1980s. Joe is no longer in his 30s. He's now in his 40s, approaching his 50s. He's real serious now into the business side of the business. And now he's sharpening his pencil. And now he's getting into the profit loss side of his business. And this phase of his business was what he called the Mac the Knife phase. And it was the Mac the Knife phase. This is where he literally just chopped things off. If they weren't profitable, he didn't want them. He had his rule of every square inch of shelf space had to be profitable. There was no longer vendors saying, hey, I'm your big advertiser, I'm your big vendor. I've got 16 products or I've got 60 products. You're going to cover my shelves in your product because I'm paying you for it. None of that. If a vendor had 60 products and Joe wanted one product, and he felt that one product was going to be profitable, that was the product that he took. If the vendor didn't like it, he'd find another vendor. Every item on his shelf had to be profitable, and he was definitely a stickler for this. So this was his Mac the Knife phase, and so you can see as the phases of the store changed, they were changing right along with Joe. Joe was changing right along with the culture, and Trader Joe's stayed in lockstep with what was happening back in the day. Well, that's a great question, Fred. Thank you for that.
No, thanks for that. And it was amazing to watch that evolution of him take place, and then how he was able to transform. I mean, it's a great story for all of us that as we age and we go through our time and you know, in this place in history, our businesses will have to evolve, because our cultures are evolving, the people are evolving, new customers are coming online, the people are changing themselves. And as you pointed out, you know, for example, the educated. Let me ask, who did Joe see as his customer? How do we describe his customer?
Well, Joe looked at that world. He looked at that world that was suddenly educated, that had never been educated before. He looked at how the world was changing, how, you know, people were traveling now, how their tastes were much broader than they had ever been before. And he sort of defined this marketplace that he called his overeducated, underpaid. That was his term. Overeducated and underpaid. That was Joe's customer. So if you fit into that, you were you were a college professor, a high school teacher, or you know, you worked in you were a scientist or an engineer, or you know, you were doing really well in sales. You're the overeducated and underpaid. And Joe wanted you because he knew you were not the sheep. You guys are the leaders today, and you guys were going to be the new leaders tomorrow. And that's who Joe wanted to appeal to. He wasn't concerned about babies. because he felt that the grocery stores did babies, everybody else did babies. He wasn't concerned at the time about animals and pets. He wanted this segment of the market, this educated sector of the market that he called his overeducated and underpaid.
And Patty, I can tell you that's how I got introduced. Both my parents were educated teachers. My mom was a high school teacher. My dad was a professor. The two examples you happen to use, and they were living out. They had just they were out in California, and they said, "You have got to go to this place, Trader Joe." And I remember going there for the first time and just getting lost in the store. I remember the wine section in particular. But I also remember, like, wow, this place is really reasonably priced as well. And that was what was so interesting about it, because a lot of what we appeal to of the educated class, typically there's high prices there. But Joe was really going after the overeducated and the underpaid for that education, so they didn't have unlimited amounts of money.
Exactly.
And they could find incredible deals. And that still holds true today. I'm always shocked at the quality I get for the price that they offer. But a powerful concept. He knew his market. He knew who his customer was. And consequently, Patty, I'm intrigued by what he doesn't sell in the store and what he does. So let's talk about that a little bit. For starters, I think you touched on it when you said that every square inch has to be profitable. Now, the supermarkets were looking at ways to get bigger and bigger and to see how many brands they could carry. 25, 30,000 items were not atypical in large supermarkets. And, and people would walk in, they want choice, was their point of view. Joe didn't buy into that whole philosophy of lots of choices and lots of well-known brands. What was it that drove him to create a very different kind of store that was not based on choice, you might say, or as much choice?
You're right. He felt that he wanted his customers to tell him what he should carry, not his vendors. He wanted his customers to tell his buyers, and he wanted his buyers to be the best in the world at servicing the customers. And what happens if the old model of the grocery stores back then was that they were vendor driven. So a large, pick a large General Mills cereals as an example. How many General Mills cereals are in your supermarket shelf? 30, 40, 50 SKUs of each, right?
Right.
And how many of those are actually top sellers? Probably the 80-20 rule, right? The rest of them are what? Taking shelf space. They're loss leaders. But General Mills buys advertising space from that grocery company and advertises their products nationwide. So they have a lot of say of what's going to go on the shelf, what's going to take up the end cap, what's going to be the featured items and get the attention of that market. The markets really are simply a vehicle for the vendors to buy their airtime, essentially, within the stores. Joe just didn't feel that was servicing the customer. He felt that was completely flipped upside down. So he wanted to set it back right on its feet and have his customers, his overeducated and underpaid folks, tell him what they wanted. And a lot of times they wanted things that they could find in their regular store. But Joe was like, well, if you can find it in your store, why should I carry it too? So Joe had this thing in his head, and this answers the second part of your question, Fred, about, what was in his head that made him want to create a different kind of a store. And this, to me, this is the whole core of the nut of his whole story. And it's one word. It's differentiation. And Joe's entire raison d'etre had everything to do with differentiation. So any ways that he could find a way to differentiate his products from the store would give Mom one more reason to step foot in his store. If he carried Swiss cheese and eggs and Cheerios like everybody else did, if they were already getting everything else, including the baby products and the pet products and everything else at the grocery store, why would they need to come into his store? He felt he had to be different. Okay, well, that's kind of a neat thing to think about, how to, that you need to be different, but how do you really break that down? How do you become different, truly different? And he breaks this down so beautifully in the book. And I love this because this is the core of who he was and a core of the company that he built. So basically, differentiation, he had 4 pillars of differentiation. 4 ways that products had to meet at least 3 of the 4 ways in order to be considered different enough for him to carry. And so his 4 pillars were obviously price, right? Price is an obvious way to differentiate yourself from your customers, whether you have a service business or a product-driven business, it doesn't matter. Another way to differentiate yourself is packaging or quantity. Another way is, the third way is ingredients. Really kind of neat if he had the freedom to sort of tweak ingredients a little bit. And of course, there's uniqueness of product. So these are the 4 areas of differentiation. And if a product could meet 3 of these 4 areas, they would now be considered to be in the store. Again, their price, packaging and quantity, ingredients, and uniqueness. And then, of course, what he did is he took his products then and wrapped them in private label. So his Trader Joe's label. Now, the Trader Joe's label makes it so that from the outside, when you walk in the door and you look at his products and his shelves from the, you already see different. He wanted you to see different from the second you walked in the store. He wanted you to see different every minute that you were in that store. And so that's why he created his private labels. And there's other reasons too, like you can hide a myriad of secrets behind those private labels that none of your competition can see, who your vendors are, what your, all of your secrets, who you're buying from, what you're paying, etc., etc. So the private labeling concept gave Trader Joe's a huge edge in that area. So to give you some examples, and this is some of the fun things that I think most of you can relate to in the store. So when his customers, see, Joe had to find a balance between what his customers wanted and his concept of differentiation. So if his customer said, but Joe, I'm coming in here for all your wonderful things, but while I'm here, I need to pick up some eggs. What do I do? Well, Joe's like, well, I can't carry eggs because they're regulated. Every store carries eggs. They're all the same size. They're all the same package, and they're all the same price. What do I do? How can I differentiate an egg? And he figured it out. He went out, he did his homework, he found a farmer in California who had eggs that were a little bit different. And he found out that these different eggs there was not enough production on any farm to supply the whole grocery industry, but there was certainly enough to provide, to supply his Trader Joe's chain, and which was perfect for him. And he found out, what he did is he made a nice deal for these eggs, and he put them in the store. And what was different about these eggs is that they were extra large eggs. Back in the 70s, there was no such thing as an extra large eggs. All eggs were one size, one price, 12 in a package. That was it. Joe comes out with extra large eggs, and he can sell them less because of his deal with the farmer, and because he didn't have vendor, he didn't have all this stuff to worry about. He was able to sell a dozen extra large eggs for slightly less than what the grocers were selling their medium eggs for at the time, which was value, right? It gave people value, and of course eggs give mom a reason to come walk into his store. So that was a really great find. And if you look at those extra large eggs, price, obviously he met the price issue of differentiation, right? Packaging, they were larger, right? Ingredients were the same. And uniqueness. He was the only guy in town that had extra large eggs. And he did this with every kind of product that you can think of. He did this with cheese. When his customers wanted, should I tell my Swiss cheese story?
Absolutely.
His customers wanted Swiss cheese, and Joe's like, how can I carry Swiss cheese? Everybody carries Swiss cheese. So he sends his number one buyer, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Leroy Watson, and he sends Watson back to Wisconsin to the cheese factory. And Watson's sitting there and he's watching the guy stir this big cheese vat. And this is how I picture it in my head. It probably wasn't like this, but I picture a big witch's cauldron, right? Big, with a fire underneath. But Watson's looking at this cheese melting in this big vat, and he's seeing that the heat is obviously central underneath the pot, because all the bubbles were in the middle, and all the way around the edge there was no bubbles. And the cheesemaker guy would take this giant scoop out the middle and put it into these molds that were really cold, and it would capture the cheese and harden the cheese before the bubbles escaped. And then, of course, when you slice it, you get holes in your cheese from the bubbles, and that's Swiss cheese. Well, the cheese around the edge, the guy would, take it out of the pot and put it in a big bin and go to the next batch. And Watson says, "Hey, what's wrong with the cheese that's around the edge?" And the guy says, "Nothing." And Leroy Watson says, "Well, what are you doing? I mean, why are you throwing it away?" The guy says, "Well, we're not throwing it away. We're just going to, sell it to a different market that's not the retail market." And Leroy says, "Is there something wrong with the cheese?" And the guy says, "No, it's the same exact cheese. It just doesn't have bubbles in it. And people want holes in their Swiss cheese." And Leroy says, "Can we have it?" So they make a nice deal, and before you know it, a giant train full of cheese is coming out to California, and Trader Joe's cuts it, packages it, labels it, and calls it Closed Eye Baby Swiss, and sells for a couple of decades until the vendor went out of business. Ultimately, actually, he passed away. But this is how you differentiate, even when your products look like other people's products. Find ways. Look at it, turn it upside down, find ways that you can do something differently with your product or your service to help you differentiate yourself in a way that gives you a voice in your market that nobody else can have.
Well, and one of the things you notice there, I thought was genius, and I still love this at the store, is that the naming of the product was very, very simple, right? Because it was appealing to the overeducated, right, to begin with, and sometimes they were going to get the little play on words or whatever it may be. But I'm sure that was a big part of what sometimes made the product successful. And this is a perfect example of it. And yet he's paying a fraction or much less than everybody else is paying for their Swiss cheese.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing. And those messages and the way he named products, he felt like those were like secret messages between he and his overeducated, underpaid customers. And these were names that he would give them that he knew that they would recognize. Brandenburg Concerto cookies, or things like that. Mona Lisa's smile, whatever. And I think that was wonderful. And he used to get such joy and such a kick out of coming up with these little things that he thought would just tickle his customers and give them a little giggle as they walk down the aisle.
There was one, I'll mention one that, that caught my attention there. He has the Heisenberg Uncertainty Blend Coffee. Okay, and the story behind the coffee is really amazing, is that he had these vintage, he added vintage to his coffee blends, and he'd have, very specific, coffee beans. But then as they processed all these different beans, some would fall off to the side, okay, at the end of the day. And so we had this large collection of beans that was a little bit of this and a little bit of that, of everything that he had in the store. And so that he would scoop all those up. It feels a little bit like the cheese story again. Mm-hmm. And this normally would have gone to waste because it wasn't vintage. Didn't fit the vintage. So we gathered all those beans together, packaged them together, and Heisenberg, of course, is the uncertainty principle in physics, and called it the Heisenberg Uncertainty Blend. I just thought it was just such a kind of funny, as you say. It's amusing of how he used names. The other was, where the other companies, big supermarkets often relied on their big vendors were subsidizing them, right? They were subsidizing them in ads And that's one of the reasons they stayed with them, and they had to get the space away to them, even though a lot of that space was not particularly profitable. But I don't want to say they were driving them, but I mean, they were subsidizing a lot of their advertising. And your approach to advertising was really not about the brand itself, but about the product knowledge.
Yes.
And, I do never leave without getting my Fearless Flyer. Of course, tell us a little bit about the Fearless Flyer.
Oh, the Fearless Flyer. That is such a wonderful piece, and it's still wonderful today. But Joe wanted a way to communicate directly with his customers again. And like you say, he's really about product knowledge. It was important to him that his employees were trained in every single product knowledge, so that when anybody walked into a store and asked an employee about any single product, that employee was well versed in that product and could answer their question or give them, point them to similar products, recommend it, the employee, I don't know the kind of questions that people ask store workers every day. But Trader Joe's employees have always been able to answer those questions. They've been very well trained to do so. Being product centric.
He cross-trained everybody too.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Let's run with that just a little bit. Talk about his employees and how he treated them compared to the rest of the marketplace.
Well, I knew Joe all the way up until the end. We signed the contract with our publisher for this book, and he passed away 1 week after we signed the contract, so he never got to see the book. But I'd known Joe for not quite 30 years, but certainly several decades. Probably the single most important thing business-wise to Joe, all the way up until his dying day, were his employees. That never changed. It was that way from the very beginning. It was that way all the way through until the end. Joe felt that without the help, the loyalty, the dedication, and did I say help, of his employees, without the partnership, without their minds and their hearts in their work, in his work, he felt that he could never have built the business the way it was without them. He felt so much in their he had so much gratitude for them, and he felt that it was important to pay them more. He felt that when you pay your employees more, you get a higher quality of employee. What he learned very early in the game, before it was Trader Joe's, back in the Pronto Market days, he learned that one of the highest costs of business, and maybe many of you may already know this, one of the highest costs of doing business in any business is employee turnover. Employee turnover, it takes approximately 6 people to replace every single employee. The cost of training, the cost of insurance, the cost of relearning, and the resources in other people that it takes to continually keep new employees coming and getting them up to speed and getting them trained and living through and paying for their mistakes is a huge cost. And there's so many unseen costs behind high employee turnover, including things like, just overall attitude of the company. What is the mood of your company? But if employees are happy, they're well paid, they have no interest in going anywhere else, they feel like they have a voice, they feel like, I think like anybody, we all want a voice. And I think that's the most important thing we can give to our employees. Now, some employees just want to hear their own voice, obviously. But generally speaking, people like to be heard. They want to know that they count, that they matter. They mattered to Joe, and he wanted to find every single way to let them know every day that they mattered to him. And you see that in the stores. You've seen that in the stores for 50 years.
Well, I can say right now, Patty, during this pandemic and now the post-pandemic, I've been to a lot of stores, okay? And some of the well-known names and restaurants and stuff, and they have to just close up the store because people don't show up for work. I have never seen that with Trader Joe's.
You're right. I haven't either.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, Starbucks pretty regularly is people don't show up or whatever it is,
Right.
or a number of places, but it's been the case with Trader Joe's. It's been very consistent. I'm going to have to start. I want to open up and read this one little section. I think it's interesting. He said, people often ask me, how many stores do you have? He says, it's the wrong question to ask. He says, what's important is my sales. For example, from 1980 to 1988, we increased our number of stores by 50%. But our sales were up 340%. You know? And so, he believed having enough stores to hedge against, against catastrophe or something like that. But he knew that it wasn't about how many stores he had. He did have this focus on, I want these stores, every one of them to be successful. And the way and I think you hit it earlier, is that so many people want this big footprint, rather than maybe a little bit of a smaller footprint and then have an extraordinary level of profitability or success. And the company did that. And while supermarkets were going out of business left and right, Joe continued to grow. He continued to increase stores all along. And I think that's the reason why, is that he had this obsession with this idea. It's about the sales. It's about the profitability, as opposed to my reach per se.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So look, I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit, and I want to move to talking a little bit about your background, Patty. This is a wonderfully written book. I encourage everybody to get this. It's a great read. You'll learn a lot about differentiation, how to treat employees, how to he didn't have these massive budgets like the other folks have in these massive brands, and how he discovered his way. And I can tell you, it's almost like a cult following with Trader Joe's. I mean, people just go in there. If you're a Trader Joe's fan, you kind of know what I'm talking about. The only other place that I have that experience is Costco, and I didn't know that he sat on the board of Costco, right? He loves Costco as well, so kind of interesting. But you're writing the main writer, Patty, a travel writer.
Yes.
And I'm going to tell you, they are... You learned something, I guess, from Trader Joe's just in differentiating your travel books. I mean, this is how my book comes in a box to begin with. Got a little Made with Love by Patty here on the side, and got all sorts of nice little. The book is just super high quality books you've got all sorts of fun little things that you include with it, including wine discs and little stickers to, put on your book. It's just really extraordinary. And just in terms of packaging you talked about, look at this. I mean, it's all wrapped in a little bow, a little bling on it. I've never bought travel books that have this kind of packaging before, but beyond that, they are the best travel books out there, by the way. Let's talk about how you differentiate. The way I summarize your travel books is that if you want a travel book to tell you where the crowds go, then I'm not recommending this book. If you want to know where the crowds don't go, where the real story of Rome is or Italy is, right? You took a little different approach to it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my background is actually in history and archaeology. I spent 16 years on the Directors Council of the Coatsen Institute of Archaeology at UCLA, and traveled for 16 years to, ancient sites all over the globe in search of lost and ancient cultures, with every kind of scientist that you can think of. And it really was an Indiana Jones and high heels experience for 16 years. But when you travel like that for 16 years, you get good at two things. One is you get really great at understanding how to sort of parse history and put it back together and make it relatable. But you also learn how to be a really good traveler. And one of the things that was missing for me through all those years of traveling around the globe was every time the wheels hit the tarmac, I was always looking for a travel book, a destination book that would sort of allow me to hit the ground running. I didn't care about tourist stuff. I wanted to know about the place, the actual destination. I didn't care about hotels, taxis. I didn't care about bus fares, restaurant. I wanted to know the culture. Who were these people? Where did they come from? What makes them who they are? Why do they look this way? Why does their place, their cities look this way? What is their background? In no cities in the world could I find a book short of a textbook or, encyclopedic stuff. But there was nothing for the tourism market that was really written for people that really want to put all the tourist stuff aside and go deep. And I'm a go deep or go home kind of girl. And I just wasn't finding that. Afterwards, I was kind of finishing up with that, and I was sent out I was also a photographer at the time, a global photographer. I was sent out to Belize for a month to shoot these Mayan caves. They were newly discovered Mayan caves that needed to be documented before they were open to the public. And that was a phenomenal experience. But I got to tell you, at the end of the month, I got home and I was so wrecked, because now at my age, the people I was with were all college students, and they're mountain goats down there in Belize, in the tropical mountains and the forests and the jungles. Boy, I've got to tell you, that was it was like a wrecking ball went through my head for that month. Sent me to Italy to just sort of go find my feet again. And I ended up in Florence for a month, just me and my camera, just to walk the streets for a month and blow off 16 years of lots of pressure. And I started looking at that city. Now I've had the eyes of a historian and an archaeologist looking at this incredibly historic city, going, wow, why does it look this way? I immediately hit the bookstores. Nothing. Nothing. I couldn't find anything for visitors that told me about this glorious, crowded, tourist-driven city. What do people do when they're here? What are they seeing? So I decided to set out and write the books that I was missing. And I decided to choose the country. It's my favorite country in the world, which was Italy, and write about I kind of write for the rest of us. When we're past the college age where we want to travel fast and go with the masses and be part of the crowd and drink and party our way through, 19 destinations in 8 days. We all did that. That's what college was for. Well, now I'm older, and when I travel, I want to go slower, and I want to go deeper. And I want to, right. My questions are better, and I've got more money. I've got more time. I want to get away from the crowd, not be a part of the crowd. I want to understand more about where I am and what I'm seeing. So these were the books that I decided to write for Italy. And I decided that was going to be my differentiator. And then I met with the Italy Tourism Bureau, and they told me that there was a real big problem in that Italy is one of the top destinations in the world. It also has more cultural heritage sites than any other country in the world. And over-tourism is bombarding all these sites. And it's just destroying these sites that are thousands of years old, and many of which we'll never get back. And they said, we know we need to spread people out, but we can't afford to do it. We can't afford the education it would take to teach the world how to stop doing top 10 travel, right? Mm-hmm. Just how do you get people to spread out and see all of the other amazing things? So what I did is I did a thing. I decided to rethink the question and say, okay, instead of educating the world and educating the industries, why don't we educate the consumer? Put that responsibility in the hands of the consumer. And so what I did is I went to Rome and Florence and Venice, spent months in each of these cities, but I pinpointed over 100 sites in each of these cities that were phenomenal, most of which are better than the top 10 sites in the same cities. And I created an index. So it's about indexing. And so all I did is I just created an index category. I don't know if it's kind of shiny and light field here, but This is over 100 sites. So you can either, take a chance and see something new by spinning the spinner, or things are categorized. But if you land on a spot, it gives you a number. You turn it over on the map. You find the number of where it's located on the map. You can see everything that's around it, because there's nothing available that tells you what sites are around you in any city in the world, period. And then you take that same little number and you open it up to the page number in the book, and it tells you about the site that you're looking at, or the sites that are all around you. So now you can spread out in these cities. The cost is the cost of a book. Your decisions, you can make decisions on where you're going to go next before the light turns green, and you don't have to just give up and say, well, I don't know what to do next, so I'm going to sit here and have fun just watching the people go by. Do that at home. If you're going to be in a fabulous place like Italy, take advantage of it. It's amazing. So these are my differentiators.
And they are magnificent. I mean, literally after getting it, it's just like, I want to go back now to Rome.
Oh, we'll take you. We'll take you. Let's all go.
Just as a function of seeing these. And I'm hoping that maybe, and I think I love that. I think that travel is also about learning and education. And that's that idea of going deeper. Maybe that's the connection with Joe, to go educated.
Yes.
We don't go because we just want a photo op in front of something. Yeah, there's a group that wants to have the photo op in front of something. I'm going there because I want to learn. I want to learn about the history. It's our history. This world is our history. Do you have any more coming up maybe down the line, by the way?
I don't usually talk about what I do in the future.
Let me just say this. I'll give you a recommendation.
Yes.
That I think that we, having been there, and I loved it, and I had to go to the library and do what you said, and buy books, other books, because no travel book, but it begins to explain it, is Egypt. There's such an incredible history there, and the tourist books are just, I want to go deep. I want to learn about that, that era as well. So that's, okay.
I'm working on it now. I will be in Egypt next month, yes.
Fantastic. Well, Patty, thank you so much. Can you maybe stay on for a little bit? We're going to go to some Q&A and things like that.
Oh, I'd be delighted. Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Yeah, remarkable, Becoming Trader Joe, and look up Patty, and I'll put it in our worksheet this week, but Patty Civalleri is the author, and then she has these wonderful travel books. If anybody's thinking of going to Italy, you need to have these books.